Both pilots.
Can you fly this plane and land it?
Surely you can't be serious.
I am serious. And don't call me Shirley.
Welcome back to Thinking Critical. This is Wes. Yesterday I had an excellent conversation with Larry Bernard. We talked about Carol Danvers, how originally one of her defining characteristics was imposter syndrome, and some of the things Chris Claremont and other writers did to save the character and elevate her before all of that was stripped away and she became a psychotic Mary Sue character. Today we're going to talk about Kamala Khan, the teenage superhero who takes up the mantle of Miss Marvel, and how Marvel Comics has thoroughly botched this character. I hope you enjoy.
Kamala Khan is a very similar sort of character. So she's a Muslim immigrant. That's the first element of her character that we know. Her family is. That's where they're grounded in. Father represents a sort of conservative Muslim immigrant story. He's conservative and traditional, but he's part of the secular world. Mother is the conservative, traditional wife of that person who keeps the traditional home life in the family. Younger brother represents the more modern strain of conservative traditionalism, kind of fundamentalism, but not fundamentalism in the we're going to kill people sort of way, just being fundamental about your religion. And she has an older sister, if I remember. And so you have Kamala being pulled by all these different influences of her immigrant background. She's also in a modern school for science nerdy kids. And so she has all of her friends she's connected to that are a part of that. So right there, fundamental of that character is torn between two worlds. She gets dusted by the Kree Terrigen Mist, torn between two worlds. Is that what they focus on her character? No. Because if they focus on that in the character, then they have to write some things about immigrant life in the United States that they might feel uncomfortable with. They have to write some things about the Muslim experience in the United States that they might feel uncomfortable with, even though the creator of the character said that was the genesis for the Kamala Khan character.
And that was from Sana Amanat?
That's from Sama Amanat, yeah. There's something really good in that character. And you also have Kamala Khan both violating tenets of Islamic law within the comic, then also being super respectful to them. And that's interesting for the character. But instead, she has to be part of the contemporary gender non-conforming feminist cultural narratives that dominates current era Marvel. And we don't get a good story about her being a kid with superpowers who is torn between her life in high school and her life on the Avengers. Who's being torn between being a traditional Muslim immigrant girl and, oh, by the way, you're meeting with the President of the United States because you're on the Avengers and the President is kind of a jerk to Muslims, but you can't be a jerk to the President or it screws up what you're doing for the big world-threatening thing.
Yeah, I actually read a team-up book with her and Spider-Man.
Yeah.
And almost the entire dialogue of that book was Spider-Man telling her how he looked up to her and how good she was. This character's 15 years old. Spider-Man's in his 30s. He's saved the world countless times.
Yeah.
The relationship feels backwards.
It is. But, it's the same reason you're seeing lots of torch passing from male to female characters in comics and movies, because they want to have that sense of empowering women. So instead of actually empowering them by, having them accomplish something, because that would be hard writing and that would be difficult and challenging, you empower them by saying, you're great. Everything you're doing is awesome.
Yeah, and they're hoping that the reader's feelings for the person giving the praise or telling the reader that this is such a good character and someone that we need to root for, that they're just going to go along with it. But that's not really how it works.
No.
The reason I like Spider-Man is because of what I've seen him do and what he represents. The reason I don't really like Iron Man is because I've read some of his comics. I don't really like what he represents. He's kind of a jerk.
He's kind of a jerk, exactly.
He's not really my character. He's, in my opinion, he's kind of morally ambiguous. So Iron Man doesn't really resonate with me. But with a Kamala Khan, they're just trying to transfer the feelings from that character onto them with faint praise, rather than going out there and doing the hard work of creating these stories and showing what the character is all about in hard situations and showing them overcome or maybe even fail and then overcoming,
What?
you know, and yeah,
Characters failing? What?
to build up, the lore and the history of that character and why you love them because you've seen them, go through the trials and the struggles and overcome like we do in our everyday lives.
Yeah. But now let's get into the Carol and Kamala dynamic. So we talked about fundamental to the core of Carol Danvers is she was an imposter, but she's now changed. She's now this hyper competent, I'm the best Captain Marvel. And this little kid says, hey, can I take your old Miss Marvel identity? And she gives it to her, and this kid does something with it. So instead of, writing an interesting character dynamic off of that, where Carol kind of resents this kid, and it builds up to the point where the two of them have a blow up and a confrontation, and then they learn to respect each other, and Kamala realizes that Carol isn't actually the hero that she thinks she is, and it becomes a don't meet your heroes sort of story. And then Carol learns, well, wait a minute, maybe all this stuff I went through that I thought was kind of terrible actually was inspiring, and maybe I should, take myself down a notch on the seriousness scale. No, instead we have, hey, Kamala, you want to help me round up people for an illegal concentration camp? That's what we get instead of actual writing, where we build to something interesting with a character that plays off of the characters.
Kind of interesting. I don't really like the MCU version of Spider-Man. I think he's Iron Lad. He's not really Spider-Man. But in the first movie, they kind of do a nice dynamic where Spider-Man receives a gift from Tony Stark, where it's basically him saying, I deem you worthy. I will need to groom you up because I see potential in you. He gives him this cool suit, and he uses it. He tries to do good. He screws it up. He almost kills a bunch of people. And Tony comes back and says, I was wrong. You're not ready for this. Give it back. And then he has to go and earn it. He doesn't give up because he had a trial. He goes and he earns it. He keeps fighting for what he knows is right. And Tony eventually realizes that he was ready all along and gives him back the gift and even gives him an opportunity to be on the Avengers. But he says, you know what? I'm not ready now. And that's a good mentor-mentee relationship where they're observing and they're working off of each other and they're both kind of growing. But you don't get that.
And then that sets up for the amazing sequence in Infinity War, where Peter once again proves he's worthy by getting on the spaceship. And Tony's like, well, you're an Avenger now, kid.
And, that's not part of comic book lore, but that's good quality writing if you want to build up a relationship to where they're not just talking about how great each other are. There needs to be some failure. And, sometimes you have to see your mentor, you have to think he's a jerk and he just doesn't understand because you're not seeing things from his perspective. And that's good storytelling. That gets you into the character and you get invested, but you don't get invested with two people just telling each other they're great.
You don't. But that's really the tragedy of the character. It was a great character, make the female face of the franchise, and to keep the Captain Marvel IP always hot. Great business decision, but instead of writing a good character, grounded in the fundamentals written by some of the best authors in Marvel Comics, they get into weird feminist theory and they start hopping around to hot trends to try to keep the character relevant. And when they spin off the character's old identity, instead of using that as a point to revitalize the character, we have the same problem. That's the really lost opportunities for both of these characters, Miss Marvel and Captain Marvel. And they're both great characters. They both have stuff that makes sense if you're thinking at an editorial level. You know what? The Muslim community within the United States is becoming a growing community. They're also a growing community globally. Also, our young consumers are much more diverse and multicultural oriented. So having a Muslim character will be good for our brand. It all makes sense. And hey, we have a good creative director who's Muslim who's going to take editorial point. We have a Muslim writer who I have some issues with how she wrote Miss Marvel #1. and some of the early ones, but she eventually gets her legs on that. Who can write the character? It's a great idea. We should do this. But they don't actually commit to writing something good and solid. So, Ms. Marvel #1. They have a whole sequence talking about the kids looking at the hot dogs. So, what's her face, the writer? G. Willow Wilson. She's a convert.
Mhm.
I'm a Jewish convert. So we have a different relationship to pork than our co-religionists. And Muslim kids steal pork at an early age in the United States. Jewish kids steal pork at an early age in the United States because it's everywhere. Your parents, if you're observant, tell you can't have it. So of course you're going to have it when you're somewhere else and your parents aren't in control of things. Of course you're going to do that. That's a thing. And that sequence with the kids in the hot dogs at the gas station, that made absolutely no sense from a authentic grounding in the character standpoint. And G. Willow Wilson probably knows better, but she also didn't want to write something more realistic because that might be offensive to the audience they're pitching the comic book for.
Mm-hmm.
So that's sort of a little bit of why this is a good character and why the bad writing decisions coming out of not building a competent story have gotten off in the weeds. And I think really, like, as much as I hate strong giant She-Hulk, you can make that into an interesting character. Her wanting to be more like Bruce because she kind of was tired of always being thought of being the sexy, smart one. You can make that an interesting story for the character, but you have to put in the work.
So a lot of what you've been saying is that these are good quality characters, and in case of Carol Danvers, for a period of times, very well executed, and in case of Kamala Khan, I think maybe not very well executed the whole time. But what's the one reason they can't do it? Do you think it's because writers nowadays are scared to show female characters fail, or maybe make a wrong choice and then have to go back on it and change direction, or maybe take that Muslim character that you've just introduced and maybe showing that she's not as powerful as Spider-Man right now and showing her grow, that they just kind of have to throw them in there as being overpowerful and maybe too close to being paragons before they've actually earned that or developed those type of experience or knowledge?
So there are several levels to this problem, but I'm going to address the one that's the most interesting and fun to me because you probably haven't seen The Gentleman yet. Excellent movie with Matthew McConaughey in it. I recommend you go see it. So there's a sequence where Colin Farrell is playing a boxing arena coach, and there's a black character, and one of his other students at the gym insults the black character in a way that's slightly racially disparaging. He's saying, no. He's not saying all black people are this. He's saying you're this and you're also black. But he's saying it from love as your friend because he wants you to get off your butt and get in the ring and do it. And we've lost the ability to really see things in nuance because the internet has removed our ability to put emotional nuance into day-to-day interactions. Because the internet is just the text, which is maybe 20% of how we communicate with people. And that's a large part of the problem, is since there's no context that these writers have in how people actually interact, they're not putting in their writing. Also, like I said with the hot dog thing with Kamala Khan, they don't want to be offensive, so they don't want to ground the writing in an actual real verisimilitude of the human experience. And that goes back to imposter syndrome in Carol Danvers, or Kamala Khan, the girl torn between two worlds. Those are real things that people everywhere can feel. I mean, you're living in the Philippines right now. You're in a different country than the country you were born and raised and lived most of your life in. So you experience the Philippines as somebody who's lived there for a long time, but you're not really from there. So that's something you can relate to if that character was well written and well executed.
Yes. I live in the Philippines, but culturally I'm not Filipino, no. Everything's a little off to me still.
Yeah. So you could relate to a character who's struggling with that. And within the superhero genre, there's all sorts of things you could build onto that with aliens and mutants and cool robots and cyborgs that are still at their core about being torn between two worlds and the struggle to how to put your own identity out into existence while you're torn like that. You can relate to a character like that if it's well written and executed. So the problem with these two characters, how they've been written, and the broader SJW quote unquote era of comics is they're not grounded in things people can relate to. They're not grounded in the things that the people who wear the Trump hats and the people who wear the F Trump hats can all say, you know, this is something I experience and relate to in my own life. That's why this will be like the comics in the 1970s and late 60s, with a lot of awkward things that nobody wants to talk about or be fond about, with a few moments of like Speedy shooting up heroin to say, wow, comics were really about great stuff back then, weren't they?
You know, Larry, I think we're gonna, wrap this conversation up about Carol Danvers and Kamala Khan. Is there anything else that you wanted to say before we put a bow on this and say goodbye?
Just putting a bow on this is the key thing about watching this current self-destructive phase in Hollywood is we're starting to see things happen to push back against that. You got, and it'll come to comics eventually, but that's because they're now such an insignificant cultural force. You got things like The Gentleman. You got things like Bad Boys for Life, which recently came out. Michael Bay did a movie called Six Underground on Netflix. So the pendulum swing is starting to come back the other way. We're riding that pendulum back. It'll take us a couple more years to get things back to a sane and normal time frame, and then we can get to those people who are angry about us at comics on the other side and say, look, we're now back in a place where we can all enjoy comics, all enjoy movies, all enjoy TV, role-playing games, video games, and cartoons all together. We can all hug it out and be brought together by what matters in our lives and what brings us together, not stupid, niche, political nonsense.
I feel you. There's nothing more that I want to get to than a place where we can all be offended and be okay with it.
Yeah.
All right, Larry. Thank you so much. Really appreciate the conversation and providing some context and some thoughts behind these two characters that should be great and maybe need to be executed better. Thanks a lot, buddy.
Thanks.
If you enjoyed this video, please give it a like. I would appreciate it very much. It helps us attract more views for the channel. Subscribe for future commentary, comic book news, and reviews. And don't forget to ring the bell for notifications. If you want to talk comics, movies, and much, much more, you can follow me on Twitter at Wes_from_TC. With that, Salamat Po, and I'm out.